to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
This morning, explosive new allegations against the Prime Minister by a former top Mandarin in the FCDO. We'll explore what it means with a top Tory MP. Also, it's justice questions today. What is the British Bill of Rights all about? We'll explore that with a leading barrister. And, of course, Starmer's Brexit U-turn. Does he really mean it? And why did he announce it in the Irish Embassy? All that to come after the headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date here on GB News. A senior civil servant has accused Number 10 of not telling the truth over claims that Boris Johnson wasn't aware of official complaints about Chris Pincher's behaviour. Downing Street had said Mr Johnson was aware of unsubstantiated claims against the MP when he was made Deputy Chief Whip. But in a letter to the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner this morning, Lord MacDonald says the Prime Minister was briefed in person over an investigation into Mr Pincher's conduct. In the US, a man's been arrested following a mass shooting at a 4th of July parade in Chicago. 6 people were shot dead after a gunman opened fire with a high-powered rifle from a rooftop. Around 30 people, including a child, were seriously injured. Police say 22-year-old Robert E. Cremo has been detained after a chase. Elsewhere in the country, at a different Independence Day celebration in Philadelphia, 2 police officers were killed by a shooter. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, is urging police to use tough new powers, including imprisonment, to stop fuel protesters bringing gridlock to motorways and major A routes across the UK. New measures to combat non-violent demonstrations that cause significant disruption, like people gluing themselves to roads, came into effect at the end of June.
So whilst it's right that people should have the opportunity to be able to express their views, as I say, we also need to bear in mind that on those roads there will be ambulances, there will be lorries taking food to shops and so forth. You know, we need to make sure the arteries of our country do remain in a healthy place.
Applications to join the police force in Scotland have dropped by more than a half in the last year. There were just over 2,200 applications, down from more than 5,600 the previous year. The force is currently in a pay dispute with staff, and the Scottish Police Federation began what it called its most overt demonstration of action in 100 years, as officers withdrew their goodwill last week. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now let's go back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning. It's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is facing discord on his backbenches after he vowed in a speech yesterday evening not to take Britain back into the EU single market or customs union. It comes, of course, as he faces a treacherous time in his leadership, preparing to learn whether or not he'll be fined over Beergate. Curiously, this speech last night, which promised to sort out the Northern Ireland Protocol, was delivered in front of supporters in the Irish Embassy in London. Well, our Northern Ireland reporter, Doogie Beattie, is outside Stormont to give us the latest on how Labour's plans might impact trade and peace. Doogie, I'm really interested in the optics of this. Why would Sir Keir Starmer deliver his speech about accepting Brexit, about making Brexit work? Why would he deliver that in the embassy of the Republic of Ireland?
It is beyond reason, and in fact, unionists have said to me here this morning that they too cannot believe that he did that. He spent a short time in Dublin about 3 weeks ago. I was there with him. Then he moved to Belfast. Unionists are saying that he's totally missing the point. Even Tony Blair, the last leader Labour ever to be elected, has said that the protocol is not compatible with the Good Friday Agreement. Something has to go because it breaks Article 6 in the Acts of the Union. It takes Northern Ireland out of that trading bloc inside the UK. It also calls into account, I suppose, any constitutional issues around the border, and most of all, in amongst the common travel area, where when the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain were both together, either inside or outside the EU, it made sense to have that common travel area. Now what we have is people that are not British coming into Dublin, coming across a borderless island, getting on a ferry and going straight into Britain. So the outworkings of that will be that in a very short space of time, we will end up with British citizens in Northern Ireland having to show their passports to get back into Britain. Emily Thornberry, obviously, this morning talking about veterinary agreements with the EU. There's always been veterinary agreements and checks on animals coming from the UK into Northern Ireland. We have horses, cattle as well, always checked. That's how blue tongue and TB and foot and mouth mainly keeps out of the island of Ireland. But it's the checks on products that are already made, ready meals, etc., sandwiches, that are causing the huge problems here. Keir Starmer doesn't seem to have connected with people who want to be British. When he came back from Dublin, lots of unionist politicians were saying to me, admiring Micheál Martin, the Irish Taoiseach, or Prime Minister if you like, of how he defended Ireland. And they were wanting somebody to stand up for the British. And of course, Keir Starmer was meant to do that, and he hasn't done, and he continues to aim for this middle ground. You can basically say that in that election that was won the last time by Boris Johnson and the Tories was more about defending Britain than it was about trying to appease those in the EU camps, and that's why such a majority came back. And I suppose Keir Starmer has went down a very wrong road with this.
Yeah, I've been reading the 5 pledges that Sir Keir Starmer made last night. Everything from the incredibly specific pledge to sort out the protocol, whatever that might mean, but also, of course, travelling musicians around Europe and a veterinary agreement, that sort of stuff. It all seems very marginal. It doesn't seem like it's either particularly specific or particularly meaningful. And I just wonder, how on earth is the Labour leader proposing to, quote, unquote, sort out the protocol? Hasn't the British government been talking with the EU, talking with the Irish Republic for the last 2 years to no avail? Surely there needs to be stronger tactics here.
Well, you're completely correct. The Irish... I spent last week, or the week before last, in Dublin doing about if a trade war happened, there's £65 billion a year travels between Great Britain and the Irish Republic. They have a very small gross domestic product, and £65 billion would be about 30% of their income. They don't want a trade war. If that happened, it would hurt them substantially. And they have said they want to negotiate. The EU are saying there is no negotiation, and there's a number of reasons for that. And the first would be, if they reopen negotiations, they would have to be ratified by the Europeans, every single country. And then you would have a position with the likes of Estonia and Poland, who are depending on British help at this minute, would have to sanction Britain in a trade war. Europe doesn't want to go down that road. It doesn't feel it could win that way. Britain's actually sitting in a very strong negotiating place at the moment, and most people are feeling that at the time of the referendum, if Britain had have moved and moved quickly, it would have got whatever it wanted. Instead, that gap in the middle caused the negotiations to go the way of the EU and for them to regroup. And now this again, with this gesturing from one to the other, is actually causing those negotiations to look weak at what they're doing. And if anything, it could force it to go very much the other way.
Well, Doogie, it's a really interesting situation, and I'm just still fascinated about the optics of this announcement from the leader of the Labour Party last night. Thank you so much for explaining the bitty detail there for us. Doogie Beattie, of course, our Northern Ireland reporter. Now, today is Justice Questions in the House of Commons, and Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab will be wearing his Secretary of State for Justice hat as he leads his team in oral questions. Top of the agenda today, well, that'll be the British Bill of Rights, of course. Last week, Raab said that the new charter would stop free speech from being whittled away by what he calls wokery and political correctness. The bill's primary aim is to reinforce the ultimate judicial supremacy of the UK's own Supreme Court on human rights issues, moving away from the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, with which the UK has frequently found itself to be embattled. But of course, this legislation is not without controversy. Clauses in the bill specifically exempt laws created by ministers from its new free speech test, meaning it won't necessarily protect people from the potential threats to free speech being imposed by the government itself. Well, let's make sense of exactly what's being proposed now. I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen Barrett, a barrister and writer. Stephen, thank you for joining us this morning. I was reading a piece that you recently wrote for The Spectator, in which you talked about the unique and difficult position that judges, in fact, British judges, had been put into by the Human Rights Act. It's an angle that I hadn't heard often in this conversation. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes. So ever since the Human Rights Act came in, we've had this Section 3, which requires judges to interpret law made by Parliament in line with convention rights. And that the tension has been on that word interpret. So imagine that you write your Christmas list. And you say, for Christmas, Father Christmas, I want an orange. And then you wake up on Christmas morning and you go downstairs and you look in your stocking and there's an apple there. And Father Christmas says, well, I interpreted your request for an orange to mean that you wanted an apple. Now, you wouldn't think that that was interpretation. And unfortunately, this is what's been happening in law. So there was a case last year where the statute said X. And it was quite clear what the statute said. More than that, the judge went so far as to say that it was unambiguous, meaning there is no ambiguity. That there is no doubt. There is nothing to interpret if there is no doubt. And yet the court found that the law said the opposite of what it said. And that's a big tension in our whole legal system and a massive change from how we've done things. And it's a change that I've lived through. So when I started studying law in 1999, I would read lots of cases where judges would say things like, oh, this is a problem for Parliament. They could see the outcome was not an outcome that people wanted, but they wouldn't do anything about it. They'd say, no, this is not for us. It is a problem, but if you want to fix it, well, that's for Parliament to do. And they would wave them off, and off they would jolly well trot and go to Parliament. And sometimes Parliament would act, and sometimes Parliament wouldn't act. In fact, there are huge swathes of law where Parliament has done nothing to fix quite a few problems that still exist today. But yes, that Section 3, that requirement to interpret is going if this bill passes. And that will free the courts, free the judges from this pressure that they've been under.
It's fascinating the way you describe it. In some ways, in the last 20 or so years, it's forced judges to stop being judges and start being legislators in and of themselves.
Yes, it puts a remarkable tension on judges. There's a second tension, which the bill also tries to address, which is on all public sector workers. And they've sort of been required to, or I don't know quite who drafted the Civil Service Code or what status really it has as law. And we've got tension with the Civil Service Code and we've got tension with the Ministerial Code as law. But there's been a tension on public sector workers to interpret laws in line with the Convention rights. That's being addressed in the bill. They're being, if you like, depoliticised as well as the courts. Now, oddly, I think it is a political position to say whether or not you want that to happen. So I'm not going to say anything about endorsing or denying that, but that is what, if this bill passes, that is what will happen.
What about those who criticise this bill, saying that it is actually, far from what you say, enhancing the role of judges, it is weakening the judicial constraints on the executive, that perhaps this is giving too much power to politicians, taking away those checks and balances that have been built up in the past decades?
Well, that's your political opinion. I mean, that's why I sort of stay out of politics, because you can have contra views, and contra views are always valid in politics. And very rare is politics sort of so extreme that the outcome is absolute and definite and clear. And there are people who politically want judges to act in a political way as a constraint on the executive and the legislative. And all I can ever say is that is not our system. So unless you want to change our constitutional system, and if you're going to try and change our constitutional system, because I'm not sure if we've got time, we'll get onto it, but the mess that was made of the Lord Chancellor, which was a half-made sort of reform of our constitution, you'd have to reform the whole lot, I suspect, in order to turn us into this different style of system. And all I'm ever really doing is pointing out that our system exists. And it hasn't been changed. And it wasn't changed just because and it's only really recently, it wasn't as soon as the Human Rights Act came in. It took about sort of 10 years for anybody to sort of change, and misunderstandings have arisen. Our brilliant President of the Supreme Court, refers to a misunderstanding because people they're too familiar with the European way of doing things. They've almost forgotten how we do things. And it's quite important that now that that's gone, people remember how our system works, otherwise they won't understand it. I mean, I took some flack for pointing out that it's incorporation is the process by which we engage with international law and control it. And that's what this is. So this bill is changing the way that we deal with this international law. Yes, sorry.
Yes, changing the way that we interpret it rather than leaving any international convention. I suppose that's the way it fits with those obligations internationally too. It's been a fascinating conversation, Stephen Barrett. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really, really appreciate your time and, as always, your interesting contributions. Now, the news in Westminster is never slow, and while justice outside the Commons will dominate oral questions later today, justice within the Commons has dominated headlines with fresh allegations that Chris Pincher's behaviours had been raised with the Prime Minister as early as 2019. Well, let's get to the bottom of exactly what has been alleged now. I'm joined now by Sir Bob Neill, Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst, and of course Chair of the Commons Justice Committee. Sir Bob, thank you so much for joining us this morning. There's been a remarkable allegation posted on Twitter by Simon MacDonald, the former FCDO top official, who said that upon Chris Pincher's appointment as a Foreign Office Minister back in the summer of 2019, there had been complaints within the Foreign Office. Those complaints had been investigated. Chris Pincher had apologised, promised to not do whatever he did again, and crucially, that the Prime Minister was informed of that process at the time. Where does that leave Number 10 now?
I think it leaves it in a pretty hopeless position, frankly, Tom, because this is yet again shifting sands, and it's one of the things that really has been concerning many of us for some time now, that there seems a complete inability to deal with what are pretty basic questions and then stick to the same line. Every time we seem to get a little bit of information put out and then it has to be corrected or changed or something else comes along. I think people are finding it very frustrating that why, for heaven's sake, can't Number 10 just be straight about it?
Is there a generous interpretation of what went on here? Of course, there's been a debate over whether or not the Prime Minister using the word resolved investigation exonerates him in terms of what sort of investigations he may well have been informed on, whether he was informed on one that wasn't resolved, but he said he was not informed of any resolved ones, or could it be more simple than this? Could it be that the Prime Minister may well have been taken aside in the summer of 2019, and we all remember what the summer of 2019 was like with the whole Brexit rigmarole, the political system of this country teetering on the brink of collapse, the chaos in Parliament that we saw at that time? Could it be that the Prime Minister, in the midst of all of that, just didn't remember a conversation with a senior official at the Foreign Office and 3 years later didn't recall it and thought he was telling the truth?
That's not a defence I want to put forward in court as a barrister, Tom, frankly, because an allegation of that kind about what was then a serving minister is, I think, even in those times of pressure, something that you would think that would register. I listened actually very carefully to what Lord MacDonald said on the media this morning. And the really concerning thing is that he maintains that the Prime Minister had been told and says, when asked, how do you know that? He said, well, the senior official who he spoke to assured him at the time that had been said. So either that senior official lied to Lord MacDonald or something has gone very badly wrong in Number 10. And whatever the pressures, I really don't think it stacks up that something like that could have been forgotten. And I think what's really frustrating for a lot of us, Tom, is that you've seen ministers like Will Quince and Therese Coffey, both of whom you and I know and who are honest people, who've been sent out there and in good faith have told things which have now been proved not to be the case. I think probably that applies to Dom Raab as well, who in the middle of an interview was told that the position had changed. I can actually believe Dom's point when he says, well, actually Lord MacDonald tended to support him when he said, well, it's perfectly possible that the Foreign Secretary wouldn't know if the Prime Minister had been told directly because government is quite compartmentalised. But once it's gone in Number 10, I think that's much, much harder to sustain, Tom.
It's so interesting with all of the latest scandals involving Number 10. It's not necessarily the fact of the appointment of Chris Pincher. It's not necessarily the fact of whether or not the Prime Minister attended a leaving drinks for a valued colleague. It's about how it's been responded to and the obfuscation around these events after the fact. I wonder, how does Number 10 pull its way back from this?
I think it's going to be extremely hard, Tom. I mean, I've been pretty clear that I'm not satisfied with the leadership of the party anyway. But there's two things that have come together here, plus a third separate one. And the two things are, firstly, just not being straight with people. And that does, in fact, impact trust. And at the end of the day, I think what we saw in those by-elections, but in the local elections, and I was very heavily engaged in locally, was a lot of traditional Conservative voters saying, oh, sorry, we just don't trust the government at the moment. And so that question, you're honest or not about it, goes to trust. The shambolic way in which it's been handled also goes to competence. And that drift moves in, I think, to the other concern many of us have about the government at the moment, is that there isn't a sense of drive, there isn't a sense of focus, there's a real sense of drift. And you see that in policy areas. People say to me, well, actually, the level of taxation that we've got at the moment, one of the highest in 40-odd years, and the level of public debt, I wouldn't mind. It's not even being very conservative either. And I think you put those three things together, for many Conservatives, you've got a near perfect storm, Tom.
That is such an interesting point, and it's something that comes up again and again in my conversations with your colleagues. It's just that sort of, were the economy going gangbusters, were everything sort of rosy on the policy front, perhaps they'd be able to forgive the occasional resignation of some nefarious minister for an alleged deed. Of course, this sort of stuff happened under previous prime ministers. I don't think there's a single prime minister in modern history who hasn't had to face these sort of, whether they're sexual impropriety scandals or resignation scandals or these sorts of things. But it's almost compounded by the fact that there's the lack of that positive story to tell. And I just wonder, is there any way the Prime Minister, and indeed the Chancellor perhaps, could win back your confidence, Sir Bob, with a big announcement in terms of the economic direction of this country, with these promised economics COVID-style press conferences from the autumn, with a big tax cut, perhaps, with a bold Thatcherite agenda?
Well, I think on the policy side, cutting tax will be an obvious thing to do, reversing the national insurance increase, for example. If you've got a real squeeze, as I'm seeing in my constituency now, with people in that sort of the middle income range, by and large, the obvious thing to do is to start cutting taxation, and that particularly help those who are on lower wages. And I think we ought to be looking to be ambitious and reduce taxation beyond that, and looking at a deregulatory agenda. So there are things you could do in policy terms, but unfortunately thus far they seem to have been ruled out by Number 10 and the Treasury. But the other issue when it comes down to the Prime Minister's position is it's easier to change policies than it is character. And I think that is the harder task that many of us at the moment find very difficult to see how that can be achieved.
Johnson was elected with an overwhelming majority amongst your colleagues and indeed amongst party members. Are we seriously trying to suggest that people didn't think this is sort of how Boris Johnson behaves normally? That, of course, you take the rough with the smooth, that he's, yes, sometimes clumsy, but ultimately can win out in a big way in other areas. You sort of got two sides of the ledger there, and clearly getting Brexit done and a big vision for energising the country won out against the character flaws that I think no one would deny in the first place.
I think it actually goes further than that, Tom, because the level of what we're seeing now it isn't clumsiness and it isn't the odd foible. This is a consistent pattern of poor conduct. And I'm afraid when you look at Number 10 as an organisation, the lead for that pattern comes from the top. And I think, if you like, the joke on that side has gone from people. And then you add that to the fact that although there was an ambitious agenda and a lot of boosterish talk, back to the point we were talking about earlier, precious little of it has actually happened on the ground. Certain exceptions, full credit to the government on the vaccines rollout, and full credit for what the government is doing in Ukraine. But in other areas, policy is largely stalled and we're in a sense of drift. So I'm afraid that generous explanation doesn't hold water for me. And sadly, in politics, like many other things, you're as good as your last gig. What worked in 2019, an awful lot of the world has sadly moved on since then.
And I suppose the great irony is last night I received in my inbox a note from Number 10 saying that Cabinet will begin this morning on Tuesday with the Prime Minister hailing the tax cut that is the threshold rise for national insurance, 80% of people odd getting a tax cut as a result of that threshold rise. And that's not in a single broadcast this morning. It's all washed out by this news from the FCDO Mandarin. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the programme there. So, Bob, I could talk to you for hours on this, but I'm afraid we've got to end it there. Coming up, it's To the Points with Mercy and Bev. But first, here's the weather.
Hello, a very good morning to you. A fine day to come for many, but there will be a few showers around. There will be a lot of cloud around. And there will be further rain in the north later, more especially overnight and into tomorrow. At the moment, high pressure's trying to build in from the west. It will have more success later in the week, but for the time being, weather fronts are still toppling around the top of that high to bring some weather into northern parts of the country. That's what we saw yesterday. And we'll see further showers here and there, mainly northwest England, North Wales, Northern Ireland and parts of northern Scotland through the day. But actually some decent sunny spells coming through for Scotland, for northern England. I think for Northern Ireland, for parts of Wales and the south, a lot of cloud remains. And as a result, temperatures not far from average, perhaps a little below in some spots, 22 Celsius for London, 19 for Glasgow, 18 for Belfast, for example. But it's for Northern Ireland and Western Scotland where the cloud thickens later, and by the evening, spells of rain move in. Those outbreaks of rain crossing Scotland into northern England, North Wales, North Midlands and Northern Ireland overnight. Mostly it's on and off, but for Western Scotland it's persistent and it will build up over the hills. But with the cloud arriving from the northwest overnight and with milder air arriving as well, it's not going to be as cool as we start off tomorrow. Temperatures in the mid-teens in many spots. And in the south, the rain doesn't reach here. In fact, it's expected to stay dry through the week across southern parts of England and Wales. Sunshine coming through as well, a sunnier day compared to today, whilst it is also warmer, 22 to 24 Celsius. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England though, cloud and outbreaks of rain, again most persistent over the hills of western Scotland where it will be cool and blustery. Thursday and Friday more widely settled, I think, and warming up, particularly in the south with highs of 27 by Friday.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only